The last entry Raymond Calloway ever wrote was not for anyone at the county. It was not filed. It was not dated with a shift number or a unit code. It was written on the back page of a leather journal in the kind of handwriting a man produces when his hands are no longer fully his own, when the pen shakes a little and the letters lean into each other like people trying to stay warm. He wrote 7 names. Each one had an address beside it. Each one had a short note. A woman named Harriet on Sycamore Road who needed her blood pressure checked every 2 weeks and would not go to the clinic because the last time she went, they kept her waiting for 3 hours and charged her $200 to tell her what she already knew. A man named Dwight at the camp past Route 9, whose knee wound had been healing well but needed one more look before Raymond could say with certainty it would close clean. A teenage boy at the shelter on Monroe Street who had been coughing for 11 days and whose mother had asked Raymond twice if it could be something serious, and Raymond had told her probably not, but he wanted to come back and be sure. 7 names, 7 people who were expecting him on Tuesday. Below the last name, Raymond wrote 4 words. Elena doesn't know yet. Then after a space that looked like a breath held and released, he wrote 3 more. That's okay. She will. He closed the journal. He set it in the steel compartment beneath the stretcher mount of the 1998 ambulance he had bought from the county for $400, the one that had sat in the storage lot on Route 4 for the past 3 weeks, because he had not been well enough to drive it. He arranged everything in that compartment the way a careful man arranges things he intends for someone else to find. Not thrown in, not hidden carelessly, placed, each item in a specific position, each one meaning something in relation to the others. The whole arrangement speaking a language he had spent years learning and never quite managed to translate into words anyone else could hear. Then he locked it. Then he went inside and called his daughter. She did not pick up. He left a message that said only that he was thinking about her and hoped she was getting some sleep. He did not say anything about the compartment or the building on Greer Street or the savings account at Ridgemont Savings and Loan that had been growing for 20 years in the patient, unhurried way that water finds its way through stone. He did not say any of the things he had spent the last 7 years figuring out how to say. He hung up the phone and sat in his kitchen and listened to the house. 3 weeks later, Raymond Calloway was gone, and Elena Calloway sat in a parking lot outside a storage facility on Route 4 on a cold Saturday morning, staring at a vehicle her brother had described as scrap metal on wheels, trying to make herself get out of the car. She had been sitting there for 11 minutes. She knew because she had watched the clock on the dashboard move from 8:04 to 8:15 without doing anything except breathing and looking at the ambulance through the windshield. It was a 1998 4350 Type 3 configuration, the kind of unit that had once carried cardiac patients and accident victims and premature infants through the streets of Ridgemont County before the county upgraded its fleet and sold off the old ones. This one had faded red and white paint that had gone dull somewhere around the second Bush administration. There was rust along both wheel wells, the kind that spreads slowly over years and looks almost organic, like something growing. The passenger side mirror was cracked, held together with a length of black electrical tape that had begun to peel at one corner. The lettering on the side that once said Ridgemont County EMS had faded to the point where you had to already know what it said to read it. Her brother Garrett had handed her the keys 8 days ago. He had set them on the kitchen counter of the house where they grew up. The house that had already been listed with a real estate agent before the funeral. Flowers on the kitchen table had fully wilted, and he had set them down with the particular kind of finality that people use when they are giving someone something they do not want. There's also 3 boxes, he had said. Dad's personal stuff from the rig. I went through them already. Nothing valuable. Elena had picked up the keys. They were attached to a plain steel ring with a small rectangular tag, faded yellow plastic with black lettering. Unit 7, Ridgemont County EMS. The tag was warm from Garrett's hand. She had not said anything. There had not seemed to be anything to say. That was 8 days ago. Since then, she had been paying $12 a day to keep the ambulance in the storage lot because she could not figure out what else to do with it and could not afford the towing cost to move it somewhere cheaper, and had not been able to make herself come here and deal with it until this morning. When she had done the arithmetic on $12 a day multiplied by 8 days and realized that $96 of money she did not have had already been spent on a vehicle worth $300 at the nearest scrapyard, she got out of the car. The morning air was cold in the specific way that November mornings in Missouri are cold, which is to say not dramatically cold, not the kind of cold that makes the news, but the kind that settles into your shoulders and stays there and makes everything feel slightly harder than it would feel in a different month. The storage lot was mostly empty at this hour. A boat on a trailer sat 2 spaces down. Someone's RV windows fogged, had been there as long as Elena could remember coming to this street for any reason. She walked to the back of the ambulance and stood there for a moment with the keys in her hand. The scrapyard on Miller Road opened at 9. If she could clean the unit out by then, she could arrange a tow-clear 250 after costs use it to cover the smallest of the 3 envelopes sitting unopened on her kitchen counter. The envelopes had come from her landlord. The first 2 had been polite, the third had not been. She put the key in the lock on the rear doors. She turned it. She pulled the doors open. The smell reached her before anything visual registered. Antiseptic, the sharp chemical smell that never fully leaves an ambulance, no matter how many times the interior is cleaned. Old vinyl. Something metallic underneath those, the particular scent of equipment that has been used for real purposes over many years. And beneath all of those, something she had not expected, something she did not have a precise word for. It was the smell of her father. Not cologne. Raymond had not worn cologne since Julia died. Not any single identifiable thing. Just the accumulated presence of a man who had spent a significant portion of his adult life inside this specific vehicle. It hit her somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there. She climbed inside. The interior was dim lit only by the gray November light filtering through the narrow windows above the bench seat. She sat down on the bench where a paramedic would ride during transport, the seat along the left wall that faced the stretcher. She put her hands on her knees. She looked around. The unit was clean. Not clean in the way that old vehicles are sometimes clean when someone has done a cursory wipe down before a sale. Clean in the way of something that has been maintained. The floor had been swept. The interior cabinets had been wiped down. The aluminum rail where an IV bag would hang had been polished until it reflected the gray morning light back at her in a dull, steady gleam. Someone had oiled the stretcher mechanism recently. She could smell the lubricant. Elena had worked in a hospital for 7 years. She had been in enough ambulances during patient transfers and emergency responses to know what a unit looked like when it was maintained and what it looked like when it was not. This one had been cared for, consistently and recently. She opened one of the overhead cabinets, empty except for a clipboard. She took it down. On the clipboard was a handwritten checklist. Tire pressure checked, fluid levels checked, battery voltage checked, oxygen tank checked. Each item had a date beside it. The most recent date was 3 weeks before Raymond died. The handwriting was her father's. She would have recognized it anywhere the particular way he formed the letter R, the way his sevens had a small crossbar through the middle, the way Europeans write them, a habit he had picked up from a paramedic instructor 40 years ago and never dropped. The handwriting was shakier than she remembered. He had been coming here in the weeks before he died, not to drive the ambulance. He had not been well enough to drive. He had been coming here to check on it, to sit in the back the way she was sitting now and run through the maintenance checklist in a hand that was no longer quite steady and make sure everything was in order for whoever came after him. Elena set the clipboard down on the bench beside her. She sat with that for a moment. Then she moved to the stretcher platform. In a standard Type 3 unit, the stretcher locks into a rail system that runs the length of the floor compartment. 4 anchor points, standard hardware. Nothing complicated. Elena had released stretcher locks dozens of times during her career without thinking about it. She knew what they looked like and how they functioned. What she saw now was not standard. The stretcher mount had additional brackets. Heavy gauge steel custom welded the welds done by someone who knew what they were doing. The reinforcements framed a section of the floor approximately 2 feet by 3 feet. The bolt heads were oversized, not factory issue, the kind used in custom fabrication work. She knelt down and ran her fingers along the seam between the reinforced section and the standard floor. There was a latch. It was tucked against the wall rail, painted the same gray as the floor, nearly invisible, unless the light hit it at exactly the right angle, or unless your fingers found it by feeling along the edge the way Elena's fingers were doing now. She worked at it with her thumbnail. The mechanism resisted for a moment, the resistance of something that had not been opened recently, then released with a metallic sound that was small and definitive. The floor section lifted on a hinge. Beneath it was a steel compartment 6 inches deep, welded directly to the chassis of the vehicle. The interior was lined with a rubber mat cut precisely to fit the kind of mat used to prevent items from shifting and rattling during transport. The mat was dark with age but clean. The compartment had been sealed. Whatever was inside had been placed there, deliberately arranged by hands that were thinking about the person who would eventually open it. Elena reached in. She pulled the items out one at a time and set them on the stretcher platform in front of her. 3 leather journals, each one thick, the covers worn smooth, with handling the spines cracked in multiple places from years of being opened and closed. The leather had darkened at the corners where hands had held them most frequently. A bundle of envelopes bound together with a rubber band. She counted them without opening any. 32 envelopes. Some of them were yellowed, the kind of yellowing that takes years to develop. Others were more recent, the paper still white. The handwriting on the visible ones was in different hands, different pen pressures, some careful and deliberate, some urgent and slanted. A bank passbook with a green cover. The name on the cover was Ridgemont Savings and Loan. The account holder listed was Raymond T. Callaway. A manila envelope thicker than the other sealed. Through the envelope, she could feel the shape of folded documents, the kind of stiff, formal paperwork that comes from legal proceedings. And at the bottom of the compartment, placed last or placed first, depending on how you understood the intention behind the arrangement, a plain white envelope. No return address, no postage. On the front, in Raymond Callaway's handwriting, one word: Elena. She sat back on the bench. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed them beginning to shake. She noticed it now, the way the white envelope trembled slightly between her fingers, the way the flutter of the paper seemed to come from inside her rather than from any movement of the air. Outside the ambulance, a truck pulled into the storage lot. The engine ran for a moment and then cut off. A door opened and closed. Someone's radio played faintly through the metal walls of the unit, a country station, the kind of music Raymond had played on Sunday mornings while he made breakfast. Elena opened the bank passbook first. The account was in Raymond's name alone. The first deposit was $300, dated slightly more than 20 years ago, 2 months after he had purchased the ambulance from the county. After that, the deposits came every month without exception. Sometimes $50, sometimes $100. A few times in what appeared to be good months, $200. Never more than $200. The deposits were steady and small and uninterrupted across 2 decades. The financial record of a man who was building something deliberately with whatever he had left over after the bills were paid. The final entry was dated 11 days before Raymond died. The balance was $43,217. Elena looked at that number for a long time. Raymond Callaway had been a county paramedic for 38 years. His peak salary had been $42,000 a year. He had raised 2 children largely alone after Julia died. He had paid a mortgage on a house in a town where property taxes were not nothing and heating costs in winter were considerable. He had driven a truck he had owned for 12 years because he saw no reason to replace something that still worked. Garrett had told her that their father's estate consisted of the house, a savings account containing $19,000, the truck, and the tools in the garage. Garrett had known about one account. He had not known about this one. This account had existed for 20 years, built in increments small enough that they would never draw attention, small enough that they looked, if anyone ever looked, like the ordinary modest savings of a careful man, which they were. They were exactly that. But they were also something else. They were the financial record of a plan. She opened the manila envelope. Inside was a property deed, a commercial building 614 Greer Street, Ridgemont, Missouri. The purchase price was listed as $28,000 paid in cash 9 years ago. The owner of record was Raymond T. Callaway. Below the typed legal name in the margin, someone had written in Raymond's handwriting, "Held in trust. C. Ellison and Parker Attorneys at Law." Elena had never heard of Greer Street. She had never heard of Ellison and Parker. Her father had owned a building for 9 years, and no one in the family had known. She sat with the deed in her hands and looked at it, and understood in the way you understand things that require you to reorganize everything you thought you knew, that the person she thought her father had been was not the whole of who he had been, that there had been a Raymond Callaway she had never met, that this ambulance was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one. She set the deed down. She picked up the white envelope. She turned it over once. The back was blank. She slid her thumb under the flap and worked it open carefully, the way you open something you understand will matter. Inside was a letter. 2 pages written on standard line paper in blue ink, the pen pressure heavier in the earlier paragraphs and lighter toward the end, as though the writing itself had taken something out of him. The handwriting was his unmistakably, but with the tremor she had seen on the clipboard. He had written this recently, in the last weeks of his life. "Dear Elena," it began. "If you found this compartment, I'm gone, and you're sitting in the back of my ambulance wondering what your old man was up to all those years. That's fair. I should have told you. I tried to more than once. Every time I started, I couldn't find the version of the words that didn't sound foolish or self-important. So I put it off, and the years went by the way years do, and I kept putting it off, and now here we are. I've been using this ambulance on my days off for a long time. Tuesdays and Thursdays mostly, sometimes weekends. I drive out to the seasonal labor camps on the county line. I go under the Route 9 overpass where people sleep when there's nowhere else. I check on a woman named Harriet on Sycamore Road because she's 81 years old and her children live in other states, and her nearest neighbor is 6 miles away. I bring the kit. I bring whatever else they need. I don't charge anyone, and I don't file paperwork. I've been doing this for 20 years. Elena stopped reading. She set the letter down on her lap and looked at the journals on the stretcher platform. She picked up the nearest one, the oldest, the leather darkest, and the spine crack deepest. She opened it to a random page somewhere in the middle. November 3rd, drove to the camp past Mill Creek Road. Woman named Darlene, mid-40s, deep cut on her right forearm from a piece of sheet metal at the packing facility. Work injury 2 days old. She had wrapped it herself with a torn strip of shirt fabric. Wound was showing early signs of infection. Irrigated, thoroughly debrided the edge closed with butterfly strips and a proper bandage. Started her on the amoxicillin I had left from the last pharmacy sample run. Showed her how to change the dressing. Told her if the redness spreads past the bandage edge, she needs an ER regardless of the cost. She nodded. Her daughter, maybe 7 years old, watched the entire procedure without flinching. Tough kid. Left extra bandages and antiseptic. We'll follow up Thursday. Elena turned pages. February 12th, Route 9 overpass. Gerald has been there for 3 weeks now. The cough is worse. Possible bronchitis, possibly early pneumonia, impossible to know without imaging. He will not go near a hospital. States he had a bad experience 4 years ago, won't elaborate. Gave him the last of the azithromycin samples. Also treated a man named Leonard for 2 badly frostbitten toes right foot. He had been wearing canvas shoes in 20-degree weather. I gave him my wool socks and drove home in bare feet. Margaret would have laughed at that. Margaret was the name of Raymond's mother, dead for 30 years. Julia had been Elena's mother. The substitution was a small thing, a private reference, but it cracked something open inside Elena's chest that she had not known was sealed. She closed that journal and opened the second one. She turned to a page near the back and found an entry dated 6 years ago. April 22nd, camp past Mill Creek. Boy approximately 9 years old, high fever and a rash across both forearms. Mother name is Frances, says he has been sick for 3 days. Won't take him to the hospital. Afraid the questions they'll ask will lead to questions she can't answer. Fever was 103.4. administered children's acetaminophen from my supply, started him on the pediatric amoxicillin I keep for cases like this. Showed Frances how to check for dehydration by watching the skin on the back of his hand. Told her I would come back Friday. She cried, not because of the fever, because someone came. Elena read that last sentence 3 times. She went back to Raymond's letter. She found the paragraph she had stopped at and kept reading. The building on Greer Street is mine. I paid cash from this account. I've been working on it a little at a time. New plumbing, electrical panel, rough framing for exam rooms. It's not finished. It's not much yet. But it could be a clinic, a real one. Walk in, no insurance required, no questions about papers or payments, just a place where someone can come through the door and get help. I know you left nursing. Your brother told me why, though you never did. I'm not going to tell you I understand what you went through because I don't. Not exactly. But I know what it feels like to carry a patient you couldn't save. I've carried one for 30 years. A woman named Grace, 41 years old, cardiac arrest on a highway shoulder, got there in time but not quite fast enough. I think about her every year on the date. The weight doesn't go away. I'm not going to lie to you about that, but it doesn't have to stop you. The trick is not to put it down. The trick is to keep moving while you carry it. Elena, I'm asking you to finish what I started. The building, the money, the ambulance, they're all yours. I put the property in a trust so the arrangement is protected. Ellison and Parker have the documents. This was always meant for you even before I knew you would need it. The journals are the record. Every patient, every visit, every person I tried to help. Read them when you're ready, and when you're ready, open the doors and keep going. I love you. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry I was not better at saying either of those things while I was still around to say them. Dad. Elena set the letter down on her lap. She sat in the back of the ambulance in the cold November morning, and she let herself cry. Not the controlled, private kind of crying she had been doing for the past 7 months, the kind that happens at 2 o'clock in the morning and leaves no visible trace. This was different. This came from somewhere that had been sealed and was now open, the way a compartment that has been locked for a long time opens differently than one that has simply been closed. She cried for Raymond, for the years she had spent thinking she knew who he was, for the phone calls she had made to him after Julia died, after Tyler Moss died, calls that she had kept short because she was tired or ashamed, or both calls where he had said the right things and she had said yes and okay and I'll be fine, and neither of them had said the true things. For all the Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, she had spent doing whatever she had been doing while he was driving this ambulance to the camps on the county line and the overpass on Route 9 and the house of an 81-year-old woman on Sycamore Road. For Tyler Moss, 16 years old, who had come to St. Luke's Medical Center on a Tuesday afternoon with an asthma attack that should not have been fatal, whose inhaler had run out, whose backup medication was locked in a supply cabinet 30 feet away, and whose grip had gone slack in Elena's hands after 4 minutes that she had replayed every night since, in every version she could construct. Every version where she moved faster or thought more clearly or did the one different thing that changed the outcome. And none of those versions existed, only the one that had actually happened. She had quit the following week. She had told Human Resources it was a leave of absence. She had told herself the same thing. 7 months had passed. The scrubs were in the back of her closet. The stethoscope she had bought in nursing school was in a drawer under a stack of takeout menus. Her nursing license, which was still technically active for another 8 months before it would require renewal, sat in an envelope in that same drawer. She had not opened the drawer since the day she left St. Luke's. She picked up the second journal again and opened it to the first page. She read, "By the time the scrapyard on Miller Road opened at 9 o'clock, Elena Calloway was still in the back of the ambulance, surrounded by everything her father had built and hidden and left for her. Reading about people she had never met, whose names she now knew, whose ailments and addresses and follow-up schedules were recorded in her father's handwriting across hundreds of pages. A catalog of 20 years of quiet, unrecorded, uncharged, unadvertised care. She did not call the scrapyard. She did not call the tow company. She sat in the vehicle her brother had called scrap metal on wheels and she read until the gray morning light shifted into pale winter gold. And for the first time in 7 months, she felt something she could not immediately name, something that was not quite hope and not quite grief, but lived in the space between them, the specific feeling of a door that has been sealed for a long time, beginning slowly to open. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Garrett. She let it go to voicemail. She picked up the third journal, the oldest one, the one whose leather was darkest and whose spine had cracked in 4 places from years of use. She opened it to the first page. The first entry was dated 21 years ago, 4 months after the date of the first deposit in the bank passbook, 3 months after Raymond had purchased the ambulance from the county. March 12th. First real run in the rig. Drove out past the county line to where the seasonal crew is camped for the orchard harvest. Tents and tarps, mostly a few old travel trailers that have seen better decades. No running water I could see. A man named Hector flagged me down at the road. His son, maybe 14, had fallen from a ladder and come down wrong on his left wrist. Clean break from the feel of it, likely distal radius. I splinted it properly and made a sling from a clean pillowcase I had in the kit. Told Hector the boy needs an x-ray to confirm alignment. He said he'd think about it. I left ibuprofen and gauze and a bottle of water. Drove home and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Julia asked what was wrong. I told her nothing. It wasn't nothing. Going back next week. Elena read that entry twice. Then she read the one after it and the one after that. Her phone buzzed again. Garrett again. She set it face down on the bench beside her. The morning was getting on toward 10 o'clock. The storage lot was starting to see more traffic, people coming to check on boats and retrieve items from their stored units. The radio from the truck that had parked nearby was still playing softer now, or maybe she had simply stopped hearing it as something separate from the morning. Inside the ambulance, the only sounds were the occasional distant traffic from Route 4 and the turning of pages. On page 47 of the third journal, Elena found an entry from 22 years ago that stopped her entirely. September 8th, the orchard camp again. Francis's boy Marcus, the one with the wrist from the spring, has a younger sister who was born 4 weeks early. Nobody at the camp had a car that was running. Francis's neighbor ran to the road and flagged me down. I was already on my way back from Harriet's place. The baby came on the floor of the rig, which is not how I would have chosen it, but is how it was. 7 minutes from when I pulled over to when she arrived. I have delivered 11 babies in my career, but the first few minutes are always the same, that window where everything is possible and nothing is certain. She was small. She was breathing. I kept her warm, and I kept Francis calm, and I drove them to Ridgemont General at speeds I will not record in this log. The doctor said her first 20 minutes had been the most important ones. I drove home at 2:00 in the morning, and Julia was waiting up because she knew from my face that something had happened, and she knew better than to ask until I was ready. I sat at the kitchen table and she made coffee, and I told her about Francis and the baby and the 7 minutes. Julia didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Go back next week." So I will. Elena closed the journal. She looked at the items spread across the stretcher platform in front of her. 3 journals, 32 letters, a bank passbook, a property deed, a letter with her name on it. She gathered everything carefully, the way you handle things that matter, and put them into a canvas bag she found behind the driver's seat. The bag had her father's initials written on the strap in permanent marker. RC. She had not seen this bag in years. She had not known it was here. She locked the ambulance. She walked to her car and sat in it for a moment with the canvas bag on the passenger seat. Then she took out her phone and searched for 614 Greer Street, Ridgemont, Missouri. The map placed it on the east side of town, past the tire shop on Washington, past the dollar store, past the laundromat that had been there since before Elena was born. A stretch of low commercial buildings she had driven past 100 times without stopping, without looking, without ever wondering what was in them. She started the car. She drove east. The street was quiet for a Saturday morning. She found the address, 3 buildings from the corner, a narrow brick building with plywood over the windows, and a faded for lease sign still taped inside the glass of the front door. The door itself was newer than everything around it, solid wood with a commercial-grade deadbolt that did not belong to the building's original architecture. To the right of the building was a small concrete lot cracked in 3 places but recently swept. There were no weeds coming through the cracks. Someone had been sweeping this lot. Elena parked and looked at the building through the windshield for a long moment. Her father had owned this building for 9 years. She had lived 30 minutes away for all 9 of those years. She got out. She walked to the front door. She took the key from the manila envelope, the one Raymond had included with the property deed, and she tried it in the deadbolt. It turned smoothly. The door opened. She stepped inside. The interior was dim, one fluorescent tube working one dark. The floor was concrete swept. The walls were exposed brick. A rough reception counter ran along the left wall built from plywood and 2x4s level and square. Behind the counter, the open space divided into 2 smaller areas separated by a half-finished partition wall. Framing was up drywall on one side, exposed studs on the other. Capped pipes came through the back wall where a sink was clearly intended. The electrical panel was on the far wall, new 60-amp service, the breakers labeled in Raymond's handwriting. In the corner was a storage closet with a padlock. Elena tried the remaining keys from the envelope. The third key fit. She opened the closet door. The upper shelf held a folder of printed documents. Building codes for medical facilities in Missouri. County permit applications blank but organized. A handwritten checklist in Raymond's script. Exam room, 80 square feet minimum. Waiting area, 6 chairs, accessible entrance with 36-inch clearance. Hands-free faucet at the sink. ADA-compliant bathroom in the rear corner. Below the documents on the lower shelf were medical supplies. A blood pressure cuff in its original packaging. A box of exam gloves, large the size Raymond had used. Rolls of gauze and surgical tape. A stethoscope in a hard plastic case, mid-grade, the kind you would choose for a general practice clinic, not for a hospital, but for a place where people would come with ordinary ailments and ordinary fears and ordinary needs. Elena took the stethoscope case off the shelf and held it. She did not open it. She stood in the storage closet of the building her father had been building for 9 years on a street she had driven past 100 times without stopping, and she held the sealed case in both hands and felt the full weight of what she was looking at. "Hey!" The voice came from behind her, from outside through the open front door. She turned. A man was standing in the doorway. Mid-60s, heavy-set, wearing a dark green work shirt with a name stitched over the left pocket. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag and looking at Elena with an expression that mixed recognition with something more careful. The expression of a person who is not sure how much he is supposed to say. She had not heard him cross the street. She had not heard the door of the shop across the road open or close. He looked at Elena. He looked at the building behind her. "You're Ray's daughter," he said. "Elena." She said yes. His name was Walt Mercer. He owned the repair shop across the street. He stuffed the rag in his back pocket and took a few steps toward her. And when he stopped, there was something in his posture that was not quite grief, but was adjacent to it, the posture of a man who has been carrying something and is not yet sure whether to put it down. "Your father saved my life," he said. 12 years ago, construction on the overpass outside town. July, 102 degrees. I went down in the dirt, and my heart stopped. Your dad was driving past in that ambulance on his way out to the camps. He saw 2 guys from my crew waving from the road, and he pulled over. He worked on me for 11 minutes until the county unit arrived. He kept my heart going with his hands. He was never on shift," Elena said. Walt shook his head. "No. He was on his way to check on somebody. He just stopped. I would not be standing here if he had not stopped." They stood in the doorway of the building Raymond had been building for 9 years, and Elena looked at the man her father had pulled back from a stopped heart on a July afternoon, and she understood something she had been understanding in pieces all morning, something that was assembling itself slowly from the journals and the letters and the passbook and the deed and the compartment under the stretcher mount. Raymond Calloway had not been keeping secrets. He had been building something, And he had been building it for her specifically with the specific knowledge of who she was and what she would need long before she knew she would need it, long before either of them could have named the shape of the hole that Tyler Moss's death would leave in her. Elena's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Garrett. She answered it this time. There's a piece of mail forwarded from Dad's address, Garrett said without preamble. Property tax notice. Commercial property on the east side of town. You know anything about that? She looked at the building around her, at the capped pipes and the labeled breaker panel, and the stethoscope case still in her left hand. It's Dad's, she said. That's exactly my point, Garrett said. It's part of the estate. It should have been included in the valuation. You already divided the estate. I divided what we knew about. If Dad was hiding assets, that changes things. Elena looked at Walt Mercer, who had stepped back to give her space, and was now standing near the reception counter examining the construction work with the quiet attention of someone who understands how things are built. He wasn't hiding anything, she said. He was building something. Building what a clinic, Elena said. A free clinic. Silence for a moment on the other end of the line. Dad made $42,000 a year, Garrett said. He was not building clinics. And yet Elena said, I'm standing inside one. She heard him breathing. She heard the particular quality of that breathing, the quality of a man who has decided how things are and is encountering evidence that he may have decided incorrectly. We need to sit down with an attorney, he said. This is estate property and it needs to be handled properly. He already sat down with an attorney, Elena said. The property is in a trust, Ellison and Parker. You're welcome to call them. A trust, the kind that does exactly what Dad wanted it to do. Garrett did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, We're not done with this, Elena. She looked at the stethoscope in her hand, at the building her father had framed and wired and plumbed with his hands on weekends while she was 30 minutes away doing nothing in particular. At the man across the street who was alive because Raymond Calloway had stopped his ambulance on a July afternoon when he did not have to. Yeah, she said. We are. She hung up. Her hand was completely steady. Walt was looking at her from across the room, not with pity and not with judgment. Just looking the way someone looks when they are deciding how much of what they know it is time to say. He chose the right person, Walt said quietly. Your dad. Elena put her phone in her pocket. She stood in the room Raymond had built and looked at everything he had left her. There was a great deal of work to do. She was not ready. She was here anyway. Walt Mercer did not talk the way people talk when they are performing grief. He talked the way men of a certain age talk when they have held something for a long time and have finally found the right person to say it to. He stood near the reception counter Raymond had built from plywood and 2x4s, and he spoke about Raymond Calloway the way you speak about someone whose absence has changed the specific texture of your days. After the overpass, Walt said your dad started coming by the shop. Not for car work, for my crew. He explained it without dramatizing it. His crew were working men, most of them guys who showed up at 6 in the morning and worked until the job was done and could not afford to miss a shift for a cut that needed stitches or a finger that needed setting or a knee that had been wrong for 2 weeks and was getting worse. Filing a workers' compensation claim meant paperwork and questions and the possibility of being pulled off a job, which meant less money at the end of a week that was already short. So they did not file. They wrapped things with duct tape and athletic bandages bought from the gas station on the corner, and they showed up the next morning and they kept working. Raymond had started coming after hours. Walt would leave the side door of the shop unlocked on the nights Raymond was coming, and Raymond would arrive in the ambulance and park in the alley and come inside with his kit. Walt had put an old shop stool next to one of the workbenches. Raymond used it as a treatment table. He had stitched a forearm on that bench, Walt said, closed it in 7 neat sutures with the kind of efficiency that comes from having done the same thing many times in worse conditions. The stain from the antiseptic was still in the wood. Walt ran his hand along the workbench when he said it, the gesture of a man indicating something that mattered. How long did that go on? Elena asked. Right up until he couldn't drive anymore, Walt said. He looked at the floor for a moment, and Elena recognized the particular quality of that pause. The pause of someone approaching something that cost them something to say. Last time I saw him was about 6 weeks before he passed. He drove the ambulance here, parked it out front where your car is now, went inside the building for maybe 20 minutes. Then he came across to my shop, handed me a spare key to the rig, and asked me to keep it running. Said he wasn't going to be driving it much longer, and he wanted it in good condition for whoever came after him. You've been maintaining the ambulance, Elena said. Every 2 weeks. Oil, tires, battery fluids. He paid me every time, even when I told him his money was no good with me. He paid anyway. Said a man should always pay for work that's done right. Walt paused again. When I heard he died, I did one final full service. Changed the oil, cleaned the interior, topped everything. I didn't know who would come for it or when. I just knew I owed him that. Elena thought about the clipboard she had found in the overhead cabinet. Raymond's handwriting shaky by then, checking off tire pressure and battery voltage 3 weeks before he died. He had been tracking it, verifying that Walt was keeping the rig running, making sure everything would be in order for the person who came after him, the person he had already decided would be Elena, the person he had been building toward for years. She thanked Walt. She meant it in a way that the word itself was not large enough to hold. Walt nodded. He was not a man who required large expressions of gratitude. He handed her a business card that had the shop's address on it and his cell phone number written in ballpoint pen on the back, the ink slightly smeared, written recently. In case you need anything, he said. The shop's open 6 days a week, and the 7th I'm usually there anyway. He went back across the street. Elena stood alone in the building. She walked through it again, slower this time. She looked at the framing on the partition wall, the careful spacing of the studs, the way the corners were squared. She looked at the cap pipes coming through the back wall and understood from their placement exactly where a sink would go, exactly where an exam table would be positioned, relative to the window, relative to the door. She looked at the labeled breakers on the electrical panel and recognized the same handwriting from the clipboard in the ambulance, from the journals, from the letter with her name on the front. Raymond had planned this down to the outlet. She went back to the storage closet and took the folder of printed documents off the shelf. She stood there and read through them slowly. The building codes for medical facilities in the state of Missouri. The county permit applications, blank but organized in the correct sequence, the order in which they would need to be submitted. The handwritten checklist. Exam room 80 square feet minimum. Waiting area 6 chairs. Accessible entrance with 36-inch clearance. Hands-free faucet at the sink. A DA-compliant bathroom in the rear corner. He had researched the requirements. He had printed the applications. He had written out the sequence. He had left all of it in a labeled folder in a locked closet in a building on Greer Street, and none of it was addressed to anyone, and all of it was for Elena. She put the folder into the canvas bag with the journals and the letters and the passbook and the deed. She locked the building. She drove north toward the church on Cedar Street because Walt had mentioned it before she left the food pantry where Raymond had spent every Tuesday and Thursday for 20 years, because the letter had referenced it too, and because Elena was beginning to understand that the picture of her father she was assembling required more than what she could find alone. She needed the people who had seen him work. The church was a small brick building with a painted wooden sign and a secondary sign below it that said Food Pantry Tuesdays and Thursdays. It was Saturday, but the basement entrance was propped open with a cinder block. She could hear voices from below. She went down the concrete steps. The basement was a long, low room with folding tables and metal shelving running along both walls. The shelving held canned goods, dry pasta, rice, cooking oil, diapers, and what appeared to be donated toiletries sorted into labeled bins. 2 women were moving a donation delivery from cardboard boxes into the bins with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this work many times. At the far end of the room, near a desk that held a clipboard and a coffee maker that had been there since before clipboards were fashionable, a woman in her mid-70s stood reviewing something on a legal pad. Silver hair pulled back firmly. Reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. Posture that suggested she had been running this room for longer than Elena had been alive and had no intention of stopping. Elena walked to the desk. "Are you Adeline Marsh?" she said. The woman looked up over her glasses. The look was precise and unhurried, the look of someone who has learned to read people quickly and accurately. "Depends who's asking," she said. "I'm Elena Calloway, Raymond's daughter." Adeline Marsh set her legal pad down. She removed her reading glasses and let them rest on the chain. She studied Elena's face for a long moment, the way you look at something you have been expecting and are now determining whether it matches what you imagined. Then she came around the desk, took Elena by the elbow with a firm and gentle hand, and guided her to a folding chair against the side wall. "Sit down," she said. Elena sat. Adeline pulled a chair beside her and sat too, turning to face Elena directly, no desk between them. "I've been wondering when one of you would show up," she said. "You knew," Elena said, "about the ambulance, about what he was doing." Adeline looked at her with the patience of a woman who has spent decades saying difficult things to people who are not ready to hear them, and has learned that the only way through is directly. "Sweetheart," she said, "I knew all of it. Raymond had come to this pantry," Adeline explained, "for the first time 20 years ago. He had parked the ambulance in the alley behind the building and come downstairs with a canvas bag over his shoulder and asked if she would mind if he sat in the corner while people came for food. He said he was a paramedic, and he thought some of the people coming in might have medical needs they weren't addressing, and he just wanted to be available if anyone wanted to talk to him. I told him he could sit wherever he wanted," Adeline said. Within a week, word had spread through the networks that Adeline did not fully understand, but had learned to trust the networks of people who live in the margins of a county and know which resources are real and which ones require things of you that you cannot give. By the following Tuesday, people were coming to the pantry not only for food, but specifically to see Raymond. They lined up at the folding table near the kitchen. He saw every one of them. "How many people?" Elena said. "Hundreds over the years," Adeline said. "Not hundreds at once. But I would see 15, 20 people some days sitting in those chairs over there waiting to see your father. Mothers with sick children. Older people who couldn't get to a doctor. Workers from the farms and the orchards who had no insurance and couldn't afford a clinic visit. He saw every one of them. He never turned anyone away. He never charged a single cent. He never once complained about the hours or the supplies or the fact that he was doing this on his days off after working 38-hour weeks for the county." Elena looked at the folding table near the kitchen. It was a standard 6-foot table with a laminated top, the kind you can buy at any hardware store, the kind that has been in so many church basements and community halls that it has become essentially invisible. Raymond had sat at that table twice a week for 20 years. She had not known. Adeline stood and walked to the far wall. "Come look at this," she said. The wall held a corkboard large, the kind meant for a community space. It was covered with photographs, holiday food drives and community dinners, and volunteer groups posing with donation boxes, Christmas decorations and summer barbecues, and the ordinary visual record of a community that had been taking care of itself for years. Adeline pointed to a photograph near the upper left corner. A group of volunteers in the kitchen, maybe 8 people smiling at the camera with the slightly self-conscious expressions of people who don't usually get their photograph taken. In the background, slightly out of focus, because he was not the intended subject, Raymond Calloway stood at the folding table near the kitchen with a blood pressure cuff on an elderly man's arm. He was looking at the gauge. He was not looking at the camera. He would not have known the photograph was being taken. 7 years ago, Adeline said. She pointed to another. A Thanksgiving dinner table's full, the particular kind of generous chaos that happens when a community feeds itself. Raymond was in the back row handing a plate to a small child who was reaching up with both hands. Another photograph, a winter coat drive, people carrying boxes from a van parked in the alley. Raymond was at the edge of the frame coat, unzipped, his breath visible in the cold air, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who knows exactly what he is there to do. In every photograph, he was in the background. In every photograph, he was working. He never wanted to be in the pictures, Adeline said. I had to catch him when he wasn't paying attention. He said once that the moment you start wanting people to see you doing good work, the work changes. That you stop doing it for the right reason and start doing it for a different reason. And the people you're supposed to be helping can always tell the difference, even if they can't say how they know. Elena stood in front of the corkboard and looked at the photographs of a man who shared her last name, and her bone structure, and her particular way of going quiet. When something mattered a man, she had eaten dinner with 1,000 times and driven to the airport, and called on Sunday evenings a man she had thought she knew the shape of entirely. He talked about you, Adeline said from behind her. Elena turned. Not often, Adeline said. Your father was not a man who talked at length about personal things. But some days after we closed up, we'd have coffee here at the desk, and he would mention his children. He was proud of you. He said you had your mother's stubbornness and his instinct for people, which he said was a dangerous combination in the best possible way. She paused. He also said you were hurting, that you had left nursing after something happened. He didn't tell me what. Elena didn't say anything. He didn't ask me to do anything about it, Adeline said. That wasn't his way. He just said he believed you would come back when you were ready, that you were too much like him to stay away from people who needed help. They sat together for a while after that. Adeline told her how the network worked the pantry as the center of it, the camps and the overpass, and the isolated farms, and the elderly people on long rural roads as the spokes extending outward from it. Raymond had driven all of it on the same 2 days every week, Tuesday and Thursday, supplemented by weekend runs when something required it. Building his supply chain from pharmacy sample programs and garage sales, and the particular kind of informal generosity that exists in communities where people have learned to share what they have because they have needed others to share with them. Some people build monuments, Adeline said. Your father built trust. It's harder to see, but it lasts longer. While they were talking, the basement door at the top of the stairs opened and someone came down. Elena heard the steps on the concrete before she saw who it was. A young woman, early 20s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a county EMS jacket over a gray t-shirt. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Elena with an expression that was careful and open, at the same time the expression of someone who has been told something important and is still deciding how to hold it. You're Elena Calloway, the young woman said. I am, Elena said. The young woman walked across the room and stopped a few feet away. Her name was Cassie Mercer, Walt's daughter. She said it plainly, watching Elena's face as she said it. Elena recognized the name immediately. Walt had mentioned a daughter. She had not yet made the connection to the journal entry, the one from 22 years ago, the one where Raymond had written about a baby born early on the floor of the ambulance during a storm. A girl who had been small and breathing and transported to Ridgemont General at speeds Raymond declined to record. My dad told me this morning, Cassie said, about your father, about who he was. She said it with the specific cadence of someone choosing words carefully, and Elena understood that the something was not simply that Raymond had died. I grew up with a story in my family, Cassie said. My dad told it at least once a year, usually around my birthday. About the night I was born. Roads were closed, storm had been going for 6 hours. My mom went into labor 4 weeks early, and my dad was trying to figure out how to get her somewhere when a paramedic showed up driving an ambulance. Delivered me right there. Dad said the paramedic stayed calm the entire time, talked my mom through it, kept everything together. They got to the hospital and the doctor said the first 20 minutes had been critical, that whoever was there in those first 20 minutes had made the difference. She paused. Dad never knew the paramedic's name, she said, or he knew it once and lost it in the chaos of that night, and by the time things settled down, the man was gone. So in our family, the story was always just the paramedic, just a man who showed up in a storm when my mom needed someone to show up. Elena looked at Cassie Mercer and understood the full weight of what Raymond had written in the third journal on the page dated 22 years ago. The Orchard Camp, September, a baby born on the floor of the rig, small and breathing. Julia was waiting up. I told her about Francis and the baby in the 7 minutes. She said, go back next week. That was you, Elena said. Cassie nodded. I'm training to be an EMT, she said. I've been in the program for 8 months. Dad says it started with that story, that I grew up wanting to be the person who shows up in the storm. She paused. I never knew his name. the person the whole thing started with. I never knew until this morning. They stood together in the basement of the church on Cedar Street. Elena and the young woman whose first 20 minutes had been shaped by Raymond Calloway, and the weight of the coincidence settled over the room with the particular gravity of things that are not actually coincidences, that are instead the logical outcomes of a man who spent 20 years showing up for people and leaving his fingerprints on their futures in ways none of them could fully track. Cassie asked if she could help with the clinic. Elena said yes without hesitating. She drove back to the building on Greer Street in the early afternoon. The concrete lot was still empty, the plywood still over the windows, the for lease sign still taped inside the door. She let herself in and stood in the main room and looked at the unfinished partition wall and the cap pipes and the labeled breaker panel, and let herself sit with the size of what Raymond had left her. It was not finished. It was not near finished. There was a bathroom that did not exist yet, only the rough framing for where one would go. There was a wall with studs on one side and drywall on the other. There was plumbing roughed in but not connected. There was wiring run but not yet terminated at the outlets. There was a storage closet full of supplies for a clinic that had no exam table, no working sink, no functioning bathroom, no permit, and no nurse. Elena sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the reception counter Raymond had built. She opened the canvas bag. She took out the bundle of envelopes, the 32 letters from Raymond's patients. The rubber band that had held them together had snapped in the ambulance, and she had put them back loosely. She set them out on the floor beside her, not opening them yet, just looking at the handwriting on the fronts. Different people's handwriting. Different kinds of paper. Some of the envelopes were cheap, the kind that come in bulk boxes. Some were the personal stationery of people who still believed in writing letters on particular paper. One was written on the back of a gas station receipt. One was a folded piece of notebook paper with no envelope at all, the name Raymond written on the outside fold in careful block letters. She picked up the gas station receipt first. 3 lines written in the cramped hand of someone not accustomed to writing more than a signature. You checked on me every Thursday for 2 years after my husband died. Nobody else did. Thank you. She picked up the notebook paper next, unfolded it carefully. Mr. Calloway, you probably don't remember me, but 3 winters ago, you drove me to the VA hospital at 3 in the morning after I called the crisis line and nobody came. You stayed in the waiting room until someone brought me back. You didn't know me. You didn't ask any questions. You just drove. I'm writing because I'm still here, and I wanted you to know that mattered. She opened a 3rd envelope, lined paper, the handwriting slow and careful. Each letter formed deliberately. Dear Mr. Ray, you helped my daughter when she had the bad cough. The doctor said it was in her lungs. You came to our house 2 times and brought medicine, and listened to her breathing with your machine. She is better now, and she started school again. I don't have money to pay you, but I made something and left it at the church. You are a good man. God sees what you do. She read 9 more letters before she found the one that stopped her completely. It was separated from the others not by position, but by something she could only describe afterward as weight, the way certain envelopes feel different in the hand before you know what is inside them. The paper was cream-colored, heavier stock than the others, the kind of envelope a person reaches for when they understand that what they need to say deserves a certain formality. The handwriting on their front was careful and controlled the handwriting of someone who had written and rewritten the address before committing to the final version. She opened it. Dear Mr. Calloway, it began. You don't know me. My name is Patricia Moss. My son Tyler died 8 months ago. He was 16. Elena's hands went completely still. She was aware in a way that was physical rather than mental of the specific quality of the silence in the room around her. The thin stripe of afternoon light across the concrete floor, the distant sound of a car passing on Greer Street, the complete stillness of her own hands. I found out about you from the hospital chaplain at St. Luke's. The letter continued. She told me that a man had come to see me twice in the weeks after Tyler died, an off-duty paramedic who had no connection to the hospital and no reason to come. I wasn't there the first time. The second time I was. You didn't say much. You didn't try to explain anything or tell me it wasn't anyone's fault or give me a reason to feel better about something that had no good reason in it. You sat at my kitchen table and you drank the coffee I made, and you let me talk when I needed to talk, and you were quiet when I needed quiet. You came a third time 2 weeks after that, and you brought groceries because you had noticed the refrigerator was mostly empty, which was something I hadn't noticed myself. I don't know why you came. You didn't know Tyler. You didn't know me. I looked you up after the third visit, and I found out you were a paramedic. Not anyone from the hospital, not anyone with a reason to be sitting in my kitchen. You came because you chose to. I want you to know something. In those 3 visits with a stranger sitting at my kitchen table, saying almost nothing, I felt for the first time since Tyler died that my son had mattered to someone who had no obligation to let him matter. That's not a small thing. That might be the only thing that got me through that first winter. I don't know if this letter will reach you. I'm sending it to the address the chaplain gave me. I hope it finds you. Thank you for coming. Patricia Moss. Elena did not move for a long time. The room around her had not changed. The stripe of light across the floor was still there, moving its slow way toward the wall as the afternoon progressed. The sound of Greer Street was still faint through the plywood-covered windows. None of it had changed, but something in the architecture of the last 8 months had shifted in a way she could not immediately describe. Raymond had known about Tyler Moss. Not the way Adeline knew, not from a conversation, not from the oblique reference he had picked up in a phone call where Elena had said she was fine. He had known the specific name, the specific age, the specific hospital. He had gone to St. Luke's and asked the chaplain and found his way to Patricia Moss and sat in her kitchen on 3 separate occasions and given her the thing Elena had not known how to give, which was simply the presence of someone who understood that the weight of a life cut short does not diminish because the person carrying it is a stranger. He had not done it to reach Elena. She understood that clearly. He had done it because Patricia Moss needed someone to come, and Raymond Calloway did not drive past people who needed someone to come. But he had known the name of her patient. He had known before Elena had ever said it to anyone. He had heard something in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes, and he had gone and found the mother of the boy and sat with her 3 times and brought groceries when he noticed the refrigerator was empty. He had carried Tyler Moss too. In his own way, in the way he carried everything without telling anyone, without asking for anything back. Elena set the letter down very carefully on the concrete floor beside her, the way you set down something that has changed its weight since you picked it up. She sat there. She did not cry right away. The feeling that came was not grief in the ordinary sense. It was something more complex, something that had grief in it, and gratitude in it, and a specific quality of recognition, the recognition of being known more completely than you had understood yourself to be known by someone who was no longer there to tell you what they had seen. She sat with it until it moved through her completely. Then she reached into the canvas bag and found the second journal. She turned to the back pages, running her thumb along the edge of the remaining unread entries, the ones she had been saving without fully knowing she was saving them. She found the entry near the end of the journal on a page where the ink was different from the surrounding entries, darker, the pen pressed harder into the paper, as though he had been sitting with something he needed to say and had finally made the decision to say it. The date was 7 months ago. Elena called tonight. She sounds tired in the way people sound when they've stopped trying to sound okay. Something happened at work. Something she is carrying by herself. I could hear it underneath what she was saying in the places where her sentences stopped a beat too soon, where she said fine when she meant something else entirely. She won't tell me what it is. That's not how she is, and that's my fault in some ways, because I was not always the kind of father who made it easy to say hard things. Julia was the one who could do that. I was better at showing up with the tools than at sitting still long enough to hear. I've carried a patient for 30 years, a woman named Grace. I got there in time, but my hands weren't fast enough. I think about her every year on the anniversary. The weight stays. I won't lie to her about that. But I kept moving. And the moving is the thing. Elena won't stay away from this work forever. She's too much her mother's daughter for that. When she comes back, maybe she'll find what I've been building here. Maybe she'll understand why I never stopped. I'm going to finish the wiring in the back room this weekend if the weather holds. Elena set the journal down on the concrete floor beside the letter from Patricia Moss. She put her hands flat on the floor on either side of her, and she breathed. He had known. Not because anyone told him, not because she had said anything direct or useful on that phone call, or on any of the phone calls in the months after Tyler Moss died. The calls she kept short because she was either too tired or too ashamed. The calls where she said she was fine and he said okay, and neither of them said the true things. He had known because he was her father, and he had been listening to the spaces between her words his entire life. And instead of pushing her, instead of calling her back the next day and asking directly, instead of saying the thing that would have required her to explain what had happened to a 16-year-old boy on a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital corridor, he had done what he knew how to do. He had gone to the building on Greer Street and finished the wiring in the back room. He had answered her silence with lumber and wire. He had answered her grief with permits and plumbing. He had answered her absence with the most patient, deliberate act of faith Elena had ever encountered, which was to build a place for her to come back to before she knew she would need to come back. And he had gone to Patricia Moss and sat with her because Tyler Moss had mattered, and the people who were left behind when someone died mattered. And Raymond Calloway understood that the way some people understand arithmetic, not as a principle, but as an instinct so fundamental it did not require articulation. The tears came then, different from the ones in the ambulance that morning, which had been about Raymond and about loss and about the 20 years of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons she had spent not knowing. These were about Tyler Moss, about the 4 minutes she had been replaying every night since it happened, about the decision to call it a leave of absence when she had always known what it actually was, about the stethoscope in the drawer under the takeout menus and the scrubs in the back of the closet and the nursing license that would expire in 8 months if she didn't renew it, about the phone call 7 months ago when Raymond had heard her sentence stop a beat too soon and had gone to Greer Street the following weekend to finish the wiring, about Patricia Moss sitting alone in a kitchen with an empty refrigerator and Raymond driving over with groceries because he had noticed and she had not. She sat on the concrete floor of her father's unfinished clinic and she let it come through her completely. She did not try to manage it. She did not count backward from 10 or breathe in a specific pattern. She just sat with it until it passed. And then she sat with the quiet that came after it, which was not empty quiet, but the kind that has something in it, the kind that comes after something has been released that has been held too long. After a while, she heard a car pull into the lot. She heard a door open and close, then another door, then the sound of footsteps on the concrete outside 2 sets, and a third voice, a man's voice speaking to someone in a tone that was businesslike and efficient. The front door opened. Garrett came in first. He was wearing a jacket and khakis, no tie, his version of casual for a Saturday. Behind him came his wife Diane in a gray wool coat holding her phone. Behind them both, a man Elena didn't know in his 50s, carrying a clipboard and a tape measure, looking at the ceiling and the walls with the professional detachment of someone who has been paid to assess and is assessing. "What is this?" Elena said. She had not moved from the floor. She stood now, slowly brushing concrete dust from the back of her jeans. Garrett looked at her and then at the room. "I brought an appraiser. We need to establish what this property is worth before we can discuss options." "There are no options," Elena said. "There's nothing to discuss." "There is, when Dad's estate includes an asset that was never disclosed," Garrett said. He looked past her through the open door to the storage closet, then back at Elena. His expression was the one she recognized from childhood, the expression he wore when he had decided how something was going to go and was prepared to wait out any objection. Diane stayed near the door. She was looking at the room with the particular expression of someone calculating the distance between what something is worth and what it would cost to make it worth more. She had not greeted Elena. She had not acknowledged the building in any way except as a space to be evaluated. "I'm not trying to fight with you," Garrett said, "but I want you to look at this from my perspective. Dad had a secret bank account, a secret building. He was living some kind of double life none of us knew about. And now it turns out Everything, every dollar, every square foot goes to you. His son gets the house, which barely covered the mortgage costs once everything was settled. You get the real inheritance. Tell me how that's fair." Elena looked at him. She had spent the last 7 months being unable to locate the voice she used to have in the hospital. The voice that came from a place below the exhaustion and the guilt. The voice that could hold a room still and direct people and make decisions that needed to be made without apology. She had thought that voice was gone. She had thought Tyler Moss had taken it with him. She found it now. "You took the house in 4 days," she said. "You had a real estate agent walking through the rooms before the flowers on the kitchen table were dead. You kept the savings account. You kept the truck. You sold Dad's tools to a pawn shop before I knew they were gone." She paused. "Then you handed me the keys to an ambulance you called scrap metal and 3 boxes of his things and told me there was nothing valuable in them." She held his gaze without effort. "You don't get to call something scraps after you've already taken everything worth keeping." Garrett's jaw tightened. The appraiser was looking at the floor. Diane was looking at her phone. "I've already been in contact with an attorney," Garrett said. "I want the trust reviewed." If Dad was making these kinds of financial decisions without telling his family, there are grounds to challenge his capacity when the trust was established. "He was building a free clinic," Elena said. "Building what?" "A clinic. With his own money. For people who had nowhere else to go." Garrett looked at her as though she had said something in a language he did not speak. Elena looked at him and saw beneath the certainty he wore like armor something she had not expected to see. A crack. Not anger, not calculation, but something that had been there since before this morning. Something that had been there since the phone call 3 months ago. That she did not yet know about, something that lived in the way he was holding himself too carefully, too still. She did not know yet what it was, but she saw it. "This isn't over," Garrett said. "He was my father too," he said, and his voice shifted slightly on the word. Father shifted in a direction he had not intended, and he stopped. "He left me what he thought I needed," Elena said. "He left you what he thought you wanted. Those are different gifts." He knew the difference. Garrett looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked to the door. Diane went first. The appraiser followed, tape measure still clipped to his belt, unused. They got into the silver SUV in the lot and pulled out onto Greer Street and turned south. Elena stood in the doorway and watched them go. When the car was gone, she stood in the quiet of the building for a long moment. Then she got out her phone and searched for the number for Ellison and Parker, attorneys at law. A woman answered on the second ring. Professional calm, the voice of someone accustomed to fielding calls that required careful handling. Elena identified herself, explained what she had found that morning, the compartment, the journals, the deed, the passbook. Explained that Garrett was contacting an attorney about challenging the trust. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Miss Calloway," the attorney said, "your father established an irrevocable trust 7 years ago. You are the sole trustee. The property is designated specifically for community health services. The trust cannot be dissolved, sold, or redirected without trustee consent, and the terms were drafted specifically to withstand exactly the kind of challenge your brother is considering." He actually mentioned the possibility explicitly when he established the document. "He planned for this," Elena said. "Your father came to our office once a year for 7 years to review and update the terms," the attorney said. "His last visit was 8 weeks before he passed. He was completely lucid, specific. He knew exactly what he wanted and why he wanted it." She paused. "He also left a note in the file." "What does it say?" Elena said. "She'll be scared. Tell her that's normal." Elena closed her eyes. She stood in the room Raymond had built on the east side of Ridgemont, the room he had planned down to the outlet and the permit and the handwritten checklist in the storage closet, and she stood there with her eyes closed and let that sentence do what it needed to do. She'll be scared. Tell her that's normal. He had known. He had known she would be standing in this exact position, in this exact room, feeling this exact thing. He had sat across a desk from a lawyer 8 weeks before he died, and he had said those words and asked that they be held until she called. "Thank you," Elena said. She hung up. She put the phone in her pocket. She walked back to the storage closet and stood in front of the lower shelf. She looked at the stethoscope in its case. She had been looking at it and not opening it all day, picking it up and setting it down, holding it and putting it back. She picked it up again. This time she opened the case. The stethoscope was mid-grade, a Littman classic. The navy blue tubing slightly faded from storage, but otherwise in good condition. The kind of instrument you would choose for a general practice clinic, not for a hospital, not for specialized care, but for the work of listening to ordinary people's hearts in an ordinary room that anyone could walk into off the street without an appointment or an insurance card or an explanation of why they had waited so long to come. She took it out of the case. She put the earpieces in and held the chest piece in her right hand, feeling the familiar weight of it, the specific density of the disc in her palm. She had carried a stethoscope every day for 7 years. She had known the weight of one so completely that not carrying it had been a kind of absence, the way you know the absence of a ring you've worn for years by the lightness on your finger. She stood in the storage closet of her father's unfinished clinic and held the stethoscope and was terrified. She stayed anyway. The letter from Garrett's attorney arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped through the mail slot of Elena's apartment on Birch Street, along with the electric bill and a catalog she had never subscribed to. She read it standing in the hallway with her coat still on, having just come back from Greer Street, where she had spent 3 hours pulling drywall scraps out of the back room and stacking them in the dumpster Walt had arranged. The letter was 3 pages. It used words like diminished capacity and undisclosed assets and pattern of concealment. It cited Raymond's secretive financial behavior over a period of decades as evidence consistent with cognitive decline at the time the trust was established. It requested a formal review of the trust documents and a full accounting of the estate assets, including the property at 614 Greer Street and all associated accounts. Elena read it twice. Then she folded it, put it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, and called the attorney at Ellison and Parker. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at the Ridgemont County Courthouse 3 weeks away. Not a trial. A formal review requested by Garrett's attorney before a judge who would determine whether the trust warranted further examination. The Ellison and Parker attorney, whose name was Carol Voss, and who spoke with the particular calm of someone who has won similar arguments before and intends to win this one, told Elena what she would need. Medical records. Documentation of Raymond's capacity in the years surrounding the trust's establishment. Evidence of consistent, organized behavior up to the time of his death. Elena spent the following 2 weeks building a case for her father's mind. Walt provided his maintenance records. Every service visit to the ambulance documented in a carbon copy receipt book dated and signed by Raymond. Each receipt included a note in Raymond's handwriting about the next planned route, the next camp, the next patient requiring follow-up. The handwriting across 12 years of receipts was consistent and clear. The notes were specific. Names, addresses, medical details precise enough to constitute a clinical record. Walt had kept every receipt in a shoebox in the back office of the shop. He brought the entire box to Elena without being asked twice. Adeline contributed the food pantry sign-in sheets. Raymond's name appeared on the Tuesday and Thursday sheets without interruption across 19 years, a record of attendance so consistent that it constituted its own kind of proof. The proof of a man who showed up, who kept showing up, who built the habit of showing up into something so fundamental to his life that it looked from the outside like simply who he was. Carol Voss submitted Raymond's medical records directly. Annual physicals, blood work, the cognitive assessments that Raymond had begun requesting voluntarily 6 years ago before anyone had suggested he needed them, because he was a paramedic who understood what early cognitive decline looked like and wanted documented evidence that he did not have it. The most recent assessment, conducted 10 weeks before he died, described him as alert-oriented to person, place, and time, with no observable deficits in memory, judgment, or executive function. He had known Garrett might do this. He had gone to his doctor and asked to be tested and had built a medical record that said clearly in the language that courts required this man knew exactly what he was doing. In the evenings after the days at Greer Street, Elena read the journals. She had finished all three. She went back to the beginning of the first one and read it again slower this time, paying attention to the details she had moved past too quickly in the ambulance on that first Saturday morning. She found names she now recognized, people she had met at the pantry, people Adeline had mentioned. People whose letters were now in a box at the building on Greer Street, waiting to be answered or visited or simply acknowledged. She found the threads connecting Raymond's 20 years of work into something that was not random or improvised, but structured, intentional, a system built by a man who understood that care without continuity is just an event, and that what people in the margins of a county needed was not an event, but a relationship. She found on a page she had somehow missed the first time through an entry from 4 years ago. October 9th, visited Harriet on Sycamore Road. She was in good spirits. Blood pressure controlled. The medication adjustment from last month has made a difference. We sat on her porch for 20 minutes after I finished, and she told me about her husband, who died in 1987, and about her daughter in Colorado, who calls on Sundays but hasn't visited in 3 years. I told her I would come back in 2 weeks. She said she knew I would. The particular way she said it, the certainty in it, the way it was not a hope but a fact, stayed with me on the drive home. That's what this is, he had written below the entry, a space after the period, then the words beginning on their own line. Not the medicine, not the supplies, the certainty that someone is coming back. Elena closed the journal. She sat at her kitchen table in the apartment on Birch Street, where the heat worked when it felt like it, and she thought about Tyler Moss, 16 years old, and about the 4 minutes she had replayed every night for 7 months, and about whether the boy had known in whatever way a teenager on a gurney in a hospital corridor knows things, whether someone was coming back. She had been there. She had stayed with him. She had held his hand. She had been there. She had not thought of it that way before. She had thought only about the 4 minutes, about the cabinet across the corridor, about what she should have done differently. She had not thought about the fact that she had stayed, that she had not let him be alone in it. She thought about Patricia Moss sitting in a kitchen with an empty refrigerator and Raymond showing up with groceries because he had noticed something she had stopped noticing about her own life. She sat with all of it for a long time. She did not resolve it. She did not arrive at a version of the story that erased the weight of it. But she sat with it without flinching away, which was different from what she had been doing for 7 months, and the difference was not nothing. The Tuesday of the hearing was clear and cold, the kind of November morning in Missouri that has no weather in the dramatic sense, but simply is itself steady and gray and indifferent to what the people moving through it are carrying. Elena drove to the courthouse in her mother's old sedan, the canvas bag with the journals and the relevant documents on the passenger seat, and she parked in the lot and sat for a moment before going in. She thought about Raymond sitting at a lawyer's desk 8 weeks before he died, knowing this day was possible, knowing Garrett well enough to know that a property tax notice would arrive eventually, and that Garrett would do exactly what Garrett did, and choosing to build a record strong enough to hold against it. Building the record the same way he had built everything else, piece by piece, with patience and specificity and the quiet certainty of a man who trusted the work. She got out of the car and went inside. The hearing room was small. 2 tables at the front, a raised bench, 6 rows of chairs behind the bar. Elena sat at the left table with Carol Voss. Garrett sat at the right table with his attorney, a man in his 50s with the polished efficiency of someone who handled estate disputes regularly and viewed them as a category of problem with a category of solution. Diane sat in the first row behind Garrett. Elena did not look at the back rows until she had settled in and Carol Voss had arranged her documents and the judge had not yet entered. Then she turned. The rows were full. She had not expected that. Walt Mercer was there in a clean shirt, sitting with his posture straight in the way men sit when they are somewhere that matters to them. Beside him sat Cassie, still in her EMT jacket, her name badge pinned to the lapel. Adeline Marsh sat 2 seats from Walt, her reading glasses on the chain around her neck, her hands folded in her lap, her posture that of a woman who has been in rooms like this before and has never once been made to feel that she did not belong. Behind them were people Elena did not fully recognize. A farmer and his wife sitting close together. A woman in scrubs who had come directly from a shift somewhere still wearing her hospital badge. Two women from the food pantry who had been sorting donations the morning Elena first came downstairs. An older man Elena had seen at the pantry but not spoken to. A young woman Elena recognized from the church basement, the one who had come downstairs with a toddler on her hip the morning after Elena had met Adeline, the one whose baby Raymond had delivered in the ambulance 22 years ago. The toddler was not with her today. She had come alone. She had come because she heard what was happening and she wanted to be in the room. They all had. Elena faced forward again. She put her hands flat on the table and breathed. The judge entered. The proceedings began with the formality that legal proceedings require: the case number and the parties and the nature of the review. Garrett's attorney presented the argument with professional clarity. Raymond Calloway had maintained hidden financial accounts for 2 decades. He had purchased property without disclosure to his family. He had structured a legal arrangement specifically designed to exclude his son from any claim. These behaviors, the attorney argued, were inconsistent with the transparent decision-making of a competent individual and raised legitimate questions about Raymond's cognitive state at the time the trust was established. The argument was made well. Elena listened to it without interrupting and without looking at Garrett. Carol Voss responded with the evidence. She presented Raymond's medical records first. 10 years of annual physicals with cognitive assessments, the most recent 10 weeks before his death, all showing normal function. She presented Walt's maintenance receipts, 12 years of them, each one in Raymond's handwriting, specific and dated and consistent. She presented Adeline's sign-in sheets, 19 years of Tuesday and Thursday attendance without a single unexplained gap. She presented the trust documents themselves, showing the 7 annual reviews at Ellison and Parker, each one documented in a meeting summary signed by Raymond and the attending attorney. She then presented one additional item that had not been in the original document package. The judge was informed that Raymond Calloway had left a sealed letter in the files at Ellison and Parker with specific instructions that it be opened and submitted as evidence in the event of a legal challenge to the trust. The judge allowed it. The letter was addressed to Garrett. Carol Voss read it into the record. It was not long. Raymond had written it. The date showed on the same day as his final visit to the attorney's office 8 weeks before he died. The handwriting in the official copy showed the tremor that had been in everything he wrote near the end, but the words were precise. Garrett, he had written, if this letter is being read, it means you did what I expected you might do, and I want you to know I don't blame you for it. I know how this looks from where you're standing. I came to your house 3 months before I wrote this. I sat in your kitchen and I tried to explain about the building on Greer Street, about what I had been doing on Tuesdays and Thursdays, about why I wanted Elena to have it. You got angry. You said it was a waste of money and time on people who weren't our responsibility. You asked me why I hadn't told you and I didn't have a good enough answer. You're right that I should have told you sooner. I'm not going to argue that. But I need you to understand something. I didn't keep this from you because I thought you were wrong about everything. I kept it from you because I knew if I told you, you would try to help in the way you help things, which is to organize them and measure them and make them efficient. And this work can't be made efficient. It only works if it's just a person and a kit bag and the willingness to come back next week. The moment you put a structure around it that's bigger than that, it stops being what it needs to be. I chose Elena for this because she already knows how to do the one thing this work requires, which is to stay with someone through the part that doesn't resolve cleanly. I love you, son. I always have. I'm sorry I didn't find better words for that while I still could. The room was quiet when Carol Voss finished reading. Quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that everyone in the room needed to hear and no one was prepared for. Elena did not look at Garrett. She looked at the table. The judge indicated that the gallery would be given brief opportunity for statements. He specified they would be personal in nature, not legal arguments, and would be considered as character testimony. Walt went first. He stood the way men stand when they are not accustomed to speaking in formal settings, but have decided that the formality doesn't matter as much as the thing they need to say. He told the story of the overpass. July, 102 degrees, his heart stopping in the dirt. Raymond already on his way somewhere else pulling over because two men were waving from the road. 11 minutes of compressions. The county unit arriving to find Raymond still working, steady and focused and unhurried as though time were not the issue it clearly was. He never told anyone, Walt said. I found out his name from his obituary in the paper. He said it plainly without performance, the statement of a man reporting a fact that still cost him something to hold. The young woman from the church spoke next. She had come in scrubs, and she stood with the posture of someone who was tired in the deep way that shift workers are tired, but who has decided this was worth the drive. She described her daughter's birth. The camp past Mill Creek Road roads iced over labor coming too fast. Raymond arriving in the ambulance. 7 minutes. The doctors at Ridgemont General telling her the first 20 minutes had been critical. Her daughter was 2 years old now. She said it once and she sat down. The farmer stood slowly with the deliberateness of someone whose joints have been worked hard for 50 years and who does not move quickly for reasons beyond age. His wife stayed seated beside him, but she reached up and put her hand on his arm while he spoke a gesture so automatic it had the quality of something done 10,000 times before without thinking. He described a summer evening, a rattlesnake in the garden, his wife on the ground before he understood what had happened. Raymond had been checking on a neighbor a mile down the road and had heard the commotion. 12 minutes from the call to Raymond's arrival. 40 minutes to the nearest emergency room. His wife sitting in the front seat of the ambulance while Raymond drove and talked to her and monitored her arm and kept her focused on his voice. My wife is alive because your father wouldn't go home until he was sure everyone on his list was okay, the farmer said. He used the phrase, your father, and looked at Elena when he said it, not at the judge, not at the gallery, at Elena, as though the sentence was meant to deliver something to her specifically. Person after person stood. An older man whose leg wounds Raymond had treated every other day for 2 weeks until they closed. A woman whose son Raymond had driven to a crisis center at 3 in the morning when the crisis line had put him on hold. A grandmother whose insulin prescription Raymond had picked up from a pharmacy 30 miles away when her ride fell through, leaving it in a cooler bag on her porch with a note that said the next pickup was in 2 weeks and to call if she ran short before then. A man who had been living under the Route 9 overpass for 2 winters and who Raymond had checked on every Thursday without fail, treating a wound infection 1 week and bringing dry socks the next, and never once suggesting that the man's circumstances were a problem the man had caused himself. None of them spoke in legal language. None of them referenced capacity or disclosure or estate proceedings. They spoke about a man who showed up on their worst days and came back the following week to make sure they were still okay. They spoke about him the way you speak about someone whose absence has left a specific hole in the texture of your life that is not filled by anything else. Garrett sat through all of it without moving. Elena watched him from the corner of her vision. He did not look at his attorney. He did not look at Diane. He sat with his hands on the table in front of him, and he looked at the faces of the people who were standing up one after another to describe a version of Raymond Calloway that Garrett had apparently never seen and could not have invented on his own. She watched something happen to his face across the course of that hour. It did not resolve. It did not break. But something shifted behind his eyes, the specific shift of a person who has been holding a story about how things are and has encountered publicly and without the option of looking away evidence that the story was incomplete. Evidence that the man he had buried, the man who went to work and came home tired and watched baseball on Sundays, had been living an entire second life for 20 years, on the days nobody in the family thought to wonder about. The judge reviewed the documentation and the testimony. He dismissed the challenge. The trust was valid and irrevocable. Elena Calloway was the sole trustee. The property at 614 Greer Street and the associated accounts were designated for community health services in Ridgemont County and were protected from any estate claim. The matter was closed. Garrett's attorney collected his files with the practiced efficiency of a man for whom this outcome was a professional inconvenience rather than a personal one. Diane was already standing, car keys in her hand, before the judge had finished speaking. Garrett did not move immediately. He sat at the table after his attorney moved away, and he looked at the space in front of him, not at any particular thing, but at the space the way people look when they are somewhere they were not expecting to be and have not yet figured out what comes next. Elena went through the proceedings in the hallway, shaking Carol Voss's hand, accepting a brief and genuine embrace from Adeline Walt's firm handshake, Cassie's quieter version of the same. The farmer and his wife stopped to speak to her, and she thanked them for coming and meant it in a way that the words themselves did not adequately carry. One by one, the people who had filled the gallery filed past, and most of them said something, and some of them said nothing, and just pressed her hand. And each one of those was enough. By the time she turned back toward the hearing room, Garrett was gone. She drove to Greer Street. She let herself into the building and stood in the main room in the quiet of the late afternoon, and she understood that the legal question was resolved, and the real question was just beginning. She needed to finish it. She called Walt that evening and said she needed help and she didn't know where to start. Walt said he did and that he would bring his tools. He showed up the next morning before noon with a pickup truck and 2 men from his crew. They assessed the space together. Walt checked the plumbing connections at the roughed-in pipes. He tested the wiring at the panel. He walked the perimeter of the building looking at the foundation and the exterior and the condition of the roof. He was methodical and specific and did not waste words on anything that was not the work. "The bones are good," he said. Raymond did solid framing. "We need to finish the interior walls, connect the plumbing, get the bathroom functional in the back corner and terminate the wiring at the outlets. I can do most of it. My crew can handle the rest." "I can't pay you," Elena said. Walt looked at her with the expression of a man who has already considered this and made his decision. "I didn't ask you to," he said. Adeline came by that afternoon with a handwritten list. She had spent the morning calling people in the pantry network. A retired electrician who had been coming to Raymond's blood pressure checks for 4 years and had told Adeline once that he owed Raymond more than he could ever repay. A plumber whose granddaughter Raymond had treated for bronchitis 3 winters ago when the family couldn't get to the clinic. A woman at the county permit office named Barbara who knew how to move an application through the system when the application was legitimate and the cause was right. "Your father helped these people," Adeline said. "Let them help back." Within a week, the building was changing. The interior partition wall was finished and drywalled on both sides. The bathroom took shape in the back corner, tiled in white with a hands-free faucet, and the 36-inch clearance Raymond had specified on his handwritten checklist. The plumber connected the sink in the first exam room, and the water ran clean on the first test. The retired electrician finished the wiring and added outlets where the exam tables would go, working with the focused attention of someone doing a job that matters to them for reasons that are not financial. Elena swept and cleaned and painted. She drove to the hardware store for supplies. She carried drywall scraps to the dumpster. She was not doing the skilled work she was doing, the surrounding work, the work that needs to happen for the skilled work to proceed, and she did it without being asked and without stopping. And it turned out that having something specific to do with her hands during the day made the evenings more manageable in a way she had not predicted. She read the journals at night. She had been through all 3 multiple times now. She had begun reading them differently, not looking for revelation, not looking for the next thing she had not known, but reading them as records, patient records. Darlene at the camp past Mill Creek, the laceration from the sheet metal, the butterfly strips, and the amoxicillin, and the follow-up on Thursday. Gerald at the Route 9 overpass the worsening cough, the azithromycin, the wool socks Raymond had given him and driven home without. Francis's daughter, born early, small, and breathing now 2 years old, and walking delivered in 7 minutes on the floor of a 1998 Ford ambulance by a man who had been on his way somewhere else and simply stopped. Each entry a life, each one continuous connected to the next. The follow-up notation at the end of each entry, leading to the next entry, the network of care Raymond had maintained tracking through the journals, the way a river tracks through a landscape, finding the lowest point, finding where it was needed. She studied for her nursing recertification at the kitchen table with the journals stacked beside her textbooks. The recertification requirements were not onerous. 8 months of continuing education credits, a skills assessment, a written examination. She had let her license go dormant, not lapsed. The distinction mattered practically, if not emotionally. She registered for the examination on a Wednesday and took it on the following Wednesday morning at a testing center in the county seat. She passed. The envelope from the state board arrived 6 days later. She was in her car in the post office parking lot when she opened it, sitting in the front seat with the engine off and the November afternoon going gray around her. The letter was formal and brief. It confirmed the active status of her nursing license. It listed the renewal date 2 years out. It used her full name, Elena Marie Calloway, RN, which she had not seen written out in 8 months. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. Then she drove to Greer Street and taped it to the wall behind the reception counter that Raymond had built from plywood and 2x4s and sanded until it was level and square. She taped it next to the photograph Adeline had given her, the one from the food pantry corkboard, the one where Raymond was in the background checking blood pressure and not looking at the camera. The photograph that had to be taken by surprise because he would not have allowed it if he had known it was being taken. The sign went up on a Saturday morning in early spring. Walt and two of his crew bolted it above the new glass door, working efficiently in the cold air that still lingered in Missouri mornings, even as the afternoons had begun to turn. White letters on a blue background. Callaway Community Health Clinic. Below that, in slightly smaller letters, walk-ins welcome. No one turned away. Elena stood on the sidewalk and looked up at it. She stood there until her eyes burned from not blinking, which was not entirely about the cold. Her father's name on a building he had bought with money he had saved in increments of $50 and $100. Across 20 years, money no one in his family had known existed used to build something. No one in his family had known he was building for a person he had known would need it, even before she knew herself. She went inside to get ready for Monday. Opening morning was clear and warm in the way that early spring mornings can be warm in Missouri. Warm enough for a light jacket. Warm enough to leave the front door open so the air moved through the waiting room and carried in the smell of the concrete lot drying in the sun. Walt arrived before 7 to make a final check of the plumbing. Adeline came at 7:30 with a coffee urn and a box of pastries from the bakery on Main Street, and the particular air of a woman who has been waiting for this morning for longer than anyone fully understood. Cassie was already inside when Elena unlocked the front door, running through the supply inventory in the exam rooms with the focused thoroughness she brought to all procedural work, checking each cabinet and each labeled bin against the inventory sheet she had created and laminated and mounted inside each cabinet door. By 9 o'clock, the waiting room had people in it. Not all of them were sick. The farmer and his wife were there, sitting near the window with the ease of people who belong somewhere and know it. Two women from the food pantry stood by the coffee urn, talking quietly in the way of people who have been sharing a particular kind of work for a long time and find each other's company easy. Walt's crew members, 3 of them, stopped in on their way to a job site and shook Elena's hand and left a card signed by everyone in the shop. The young woman from the church basement sat in one of Adeline's donated chairs, which were mismatched and sturdy and perfect, in a way that matched furniture cannot, be holding a cup of coffee and watching the room fill with the expression of someone witnessing something they had doubted and are relieved to find real. An older couple Elena recognized from the hearing sat in the corner holding hands, not speaking. They had not come because they were sick. They had come because this place existed on a street in Ridgemont County that had not had anything like it before, and they wanted to be present when the doors opened because some things deserve a witness. Elena stood behind the reception counter and looked at the room and felt the specific thing that had been tight in her chest for 8 months slowly, incrementally begin to release its grip. Not gone. She did not expect it to be gone. The weight Raymond had described in the journal the woman named Grace he had carried for 30 years. She understood now that she would carry Tyler Moss in the same way, on the same terms. She would carry Patricia Moss sitting alone in a kitchen. She would carry the 4 minutes she could not get back. The weight was not the problem. The stopping was the problem. She heard the front door. She looked up. Garrett stood in the doorway. He was alone. No Diane, no attorney. He was wearing a jacket and no tie, his version of informal. and he was holding nothing, no clipboard, no phone. He stood in the doorway and looked at the waiting room with an expression Elena had not seen on him before, the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he was not planning to arrive and is still determining what that means. She came around from behind the reception desk. They went outside together, stopping on the sidewalk beside the ambulance which Walt had given a final service, and parked at the edge of the lot. The morning light caught the old chrome and made it bright. The paint was still faded. The wheel wells were still rusted. The mirror on the passenger side was still held together with electrical tape, the tape's edge still beginning to peel at one corner. The vehicle her brother had called scrap metal. The vehicle her father had called a beginning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Garrett looked at the clinic, at the sign above the glass door at the waiting room, visible through the window, where people were sitting with coffee and talking quietly. He looked at it the way you look at something you did not expect to feel anything about, and are discovering against your own intentions that you feel something about it. I sat in that hearing room, Garrett said, and I listened to every person who stood up. He paused, not searching for words, but allowing them to arrive at their own pace. The pace of a man saying something he has not said before and needs to say correctly. And I understood something I should have understood a long time ago. Elena leaned against the ambulance and listened. I didn't know him, Garrett said. I thought I did. I knew a man who went to work and came home tired and ate the same breakfast every morning and watched baseball on Sundays. I knew a man who was quiet and careful and never spent money he didn't have to spend. But I never asked what tired him out. I never asked where he went on Tuesdays. He looked at the ground. He was not a man who found it natural to stand still with an admission, and the stillness was costing him something visible. There's something I haven't told you, he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a white envelope. He held it for a moment before he spoke, and Elena recognized the gesture. The gesture of someone preparing to hand over something that has been in their possession longer than it should have been. Dad came to my house 3 months before he died, Garrett said. Drove the ambulance, parked it in front of the house, knocked on the door. I was home. Diane was out. He paused. He came inside and sat at the kitchen table, and he tried to tell me about this, about Greer Street, about what he had been doing on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He was trying to explain it to me in a way I would understand. He said he wanted me to know before he was gone. He said he had been meaning to tell me for a long time, and he was running out of time. Garrett's voice was steady. The steadiness was the kind that comes from having rehearsed something, from having said it to yourself in the car and in the shower and in the middle of the night enough times that you can deliver it now without breaking, even though it costs the same as it always did. I told him it was a waste, Garrett said. I told him spending his savings on a building in a part of town nobody cared about, treating people who weren't our responsibility. It was a waste of his time and his money and whatever years he had left. I told him he should be thinking about himself for once instead of strangers. He stopped. He looked at the ambulance. He stood up from the table, Garrett said. He put his jacket on. He was slow about it the way he'd gotten slow about everything near the end, and I watched him do it, and I didn't say anything to stop him. He walked to the door, and before he went out, he turned around and looked at me, and he said, I tried, son. The morning air was completely still. Those 3 words sat between them on the sidewalk outside the clinic, where people were drinking coffee and waiting to be seen. I tried, son. I didn't answer, Garrett said. I let him walk out. I watched the ambulance pull away from the curb, and I stood at the window, and I didn't call him back. That was the last real conversation we had. He paused, and then 3 months later he was gone, and those were the last words between us, the ones I didn't answer. He held the envelope out to Elena. Inside was a check made out to Callaway Community Health Clinic, $12,000. His half of the house proceeds after the mortgage and costs. He said it's not enough. He said it plainly without the hedge of explanation, simply as fact. It's a start. Elena took the envelope. She looked at it and then at her brother. He was not the man who had dangled the ambulance keys over the kitchen counter on the day after the funeral, who had handed her 3 boxes of what he called nothing valuable and set the tape gun down with the finality of someone who had already moved on. He was also not entirely someone new. He was standing in a parking lot outside a clinic on Greer Street on a spring morning, doing the only thing he knew how to do with something he could not undo, which was to show up and hand over what he had and say it wasn't enough and mean it. "Thank you," Elena said. He nodded. He looked at the clinic window again, at the people visible inside. He knew Garrett said quietly, "When he left my house, he knew I wasn't going to call him back, and he went ahead and finished building it anyway." That was who he was, Elena said. Garrett stood there for another moment. He looked at the sign above the door, Callaway Community Health Clinic. His father's name above a door on Greer Street that would open every morning to anyone who needed to come through it. He stood and looked at it the way you look at something that tells you something true about a person you thought you knew and were wrong about, and the telling is not comfortable, but it is necessary. He did not hug her, and she did not hug him. That was not where they were yet, and both of them understood it without negotiating it. But he stayed another few minutes standing beside the ambulance in the morning light, and she stood with him, and that was something. That was in the specific register of two people who have never found it easy to stand still with each other quite a lot. He walked to his car. Elena watched him go. She did not wonder this time whether he was coming back. She went inside. The first patient arrived at 9:20. A woman came through the front door carrying a small boy against her shoulder. The boy may be 2 years old, his cheeks flushed and damp, his head resting in the curve of her neck with the heavy trust of a sick child. The woman's eyes were wide and tired, the eyes of someone who had been up since 3 in the morning trying to determine how serious something was, and had finally decided she needed another person to tell her. She stopped just inside the door and looked at the room and then at Elena. "Is this the clinic?" she said. "A woman at the laundromat told me about it. She said you don't turn anyone away." "That's right," Elena said. "Come on in." She brought them into the first exam room. The room was finished. White walls, clean light from the window Raymond had specified in the original plans. The plans he had drawn on his own kitchen table years before Elena knew this building existed. The sink Walt had connected ran clear and steady at the first turn of the faucet the day the plumber declared the work done. The exam table Adeline had sourced from a closed clinic in the next county stood against the far wall covered with a fresh paper drape. The labeled cabinets held supplies organized by Cassie according to the inventory system she had built from scratch, checking each item against Raymond's own supply notes from the storage closet. On the counter sat the stethoscope in its navy blue case, the one Elena had opened in the storage closet on the day she first came to Greer Street and had held in both hands and been unable to put back. Elena washed her hands at the sink. She dried them. She turned to the woman and the boy. "How long has the fever been going?" she said. "Since yesterday afternoon," the woman said. "I gave him acetaminophen, but it keeps coming back. He won't eat anything. He just wants to be held." The boy looked at Elena from the safety of his mother's shoulder with the evaluating wariness of a sick child in an unfamiliar place. His eyes were bright with fever. His cheeks were the particular pink red of a temperature that needed attention. "I'm going to take his temperature first," Elena said. "Can you hold him still for just a second?" She placed the thermometer gently against the boy's ear. He fussed and turned his face more firmly into his mother's neck. Elena waited the 2 seconds the instrument required. 102.4, she said. She took the stethoscope from the counter. She fitted the earpieces and held the chest piece in her right hand, and for a moment, just a moment, she was aware of the weight of it in a way that would fade over time, but was present now. The specific weight of something returned to after an absence, the weight of a tool that had been waiting. She placed the bell against the boy's back between the shoulder blades and she listened. Clear breath sounds. No crackle, no wheeze, no the dull quality that suggested fluid. She checked his ears both sides. She looked at his throat with the pen light from the counter. She pressed gently on his abdomen while the boy protested without conviction, more tired than upset. She had not done this in 8 months. She had done it thousands of times before that. The knowledge was there intact, the way physical knowledge is stored differently from other kinds of knowledge in the hands and in the instincts rather than only in the memory. The accumulated competence of 7 years of clinical work present and reliable waiting for her to use it. Viral fever, most likely, she told the mother. His chest is clear. There's no sign of bacterial infection in his throat or his ears. He's mildly dehydrated, which is making him feel worse than he needs to. She took a bottle of children's electrolyte solution from the supply shelf and held the mother's hand and pressed the back of it gently, showing the skin rebound, slowly demonstrating the sign Raymond had taught a mother at the orchard camp 20 years ago. The same technique passed forward through the journals and through the hands of a man who had shown up every Tuesday and Thursday and never charged a cent and never turned anyone away. "Come back in 2 days if the fever doesn't break," Elena said. "No charge. That's what we're here for." The woman's eyes filled. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't know where else to go." "You're in the right place," Elena said. She walked them to the door and watched the woman carry the boy across the lot to a sedan with a car seat in the back and a cracked tail light that had been cracked for a while. The woman buckled the boy in with the careful efficiency of a mother who has performed this action thousands of times, pulled out of the lot, and turned onto Greer Street, heading west. Elena stood in the doorway. Behind her in the waiting room, there were 3 more people now. A man with a bandaged hand that needed a proper look. An older woman with a cane who had been waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting, but relieved to finally be somewhere that would see her. A teenager with the particular posture of someone who does not want to be somewhere and whose parent had overruled the objection. Sitting in one of Adeline's mismatched chairs with his arms crossed and his eyes on the window. The afternoon passed in the way that first days pass when the work is real, not cleanly or triumphantly, but in the incremental, imperfect accumulation of small, useful things done as well as possible with the resources available. A wound cleaned and properly dressed, a blood pressure reading that needed monitoring, and an appointment scheduled to come back and check it. A respiratory infection treated with a course of antibiotics written on a prescription pad with Callaway Community Health Clinic printed at the top. The teenager, whose posture had softened by the time Elena got to him, turned out to have an ear infection that had been bothering him for a week and a half and that his mother had correctly suspected, but that he had declined to admit. Elena did not make anything of the admission. She wrote the prescription and told him it would clear up in 3 or 4 days, and he said okay and stood up with the particular relief of someone who has been uncomfortable for too long and has finally allowed someone to help. The last patient left at 4:30. Cassie cleaned the exam rooms. Adeline covered the remaining pastries and packed the coffee urn. Walt came in from the shop across the street to check the plumbing, one final time, the act of a man for whom the habit of checking has become permanent, and said everything was running clean. They left one by one. Elena locked the front door. She stood in the empty clinic for a moment in the quiet that comes after a day of work, when the work has been real, when the people who came through the door needed something and left with it, when the day has been used for what days are for. She went outside. The evening was settling in, the light going golden and low across the rooftops of Greer Street, the tire shop, in the dollar store, and the laundromat with its handwritten sign, all of it going warm in the last light of a day in early spring in Missouri. She walked to the ambulance and stood beside it. She thought about Raymond driving this vehicle on Tuesday and Thursday mornings for 20 years. Pulling out of whatever parking lot or storage facility he was keeping it in at the time, pointing east or south or wherever the day's route required his kit bag behind the driver's seat, his journals in the steel compartment under the stretcher mount, his 7 names written on the last page of the last journal he would fill. Going to see people who were expecting him because he had told them he would come back, and he came back and they knew he would. And that certainty was the thing. The medicine and the supplies were just the delivery mechanism for that specific thing. She knelt down and worked the release on the rear doors and opened them. She climbed inside. She sat for a moment on the bench seat where she had sat on a cold Saturday morning in November when she had come to clean it out and sell it for scrap and had instead found the first item of a catalog of 20 years of her father's life. She moved to the stretcher platform. She knelt down. She found the latch flush against the wall rail, painted the same gray as the floor. She worked it with her thumbnail. It resisted once and then released with the small, definitive click of a mechanism that has been opened before and remembers how. She lifted the floor section on its hinge. The compartment was empty. She had known it would be. She had taken everything out on that first morning, carried it to the canvas bag with her father's initials on the strap, driven east to Greer Street, and spent the following months turning the contents into everything visible through the clinic window, the drywall and the plumbing, and the nursing license taped to the wall behind the reception desk. Everything that had been sealed in the dark was out in the open now. Every name in the journals was a person who might come through the door. Every dollar in the savings account had become a floor or a wall or a box of exam gloves. The 32 letters from patients were in a box on the reception counter, and the letter from Patricia Moss was in a separate envelope that Elena had set aside because she had decided she needed to write back. Needed to tell Patricia Moss that her son had mattered to more people than Patricia Moss had known. That Raymond Calloway had known Tyler's name and had found his way to her kitchen 3 times because he believed in the same thing he had written in the journal 4 years ago about Harriet on Sycamore Road. Not the medicine, not the supplies, the certainty that someone is coming back. The compartment that her father had built and filled and sealed was empty. She rested her hand on the edge of it. Then she sat back on the bench seat and looked at the interior of the ambulance. At the aluminum rail where the IV bag would hang, still showing the polish Walt had given it on the day Raymond asked him to keep the rig running. At the overhead cabinet where she had found the clipboard with the maintenance checklist in Raymond's shaky handwriting 3 weeks before he died, checking off tire pressure and battery voltage in a hand that was no longer quite steady because he needed to know that everything would be ready for whoever came after him. At the floor where the latch was nearly invisible, unless you knew it was there, unless your fingers found it by feeling along the edge. Through the clinic window, she could see the lights still on. The shadow of Cassie moving through the exam room on a final pass, checking each cabinet against the laminated inventory sheet. The shape of the waiting room chairs in the warm light mismatched and sufficient. The nursing license taped to the wall behind the reception desk, her full name printed on it in official type. Elena Marie Calloway, R.N., her father's name above the door. Raymond Calloway had spent his life showing up for people nobody else showed up for. He had done it quietly without documentation that was ever meant to be filed, without recognition that was ever meant to be given, without telling his children or his coworkers, or anyone else who might have thought it was admirable, because he had understood from the beginning that the moment you want to be seen doing the work becomes about something other than the people you are supposed to be helping. He had done it on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 20 years, while his family ate dinner 30 minutes away and thought they knew who he was. And when he understood that the time was coming when he would not be able to do it anymore, he did not accept that as an end. He went to an attorney's office once a year for 7 years and reviewed the terms of a trust. He went to a doctor and asked to be assessed and built a record that said, clearly in the language courts required, this man knew exactly what he was doing. He drove the ambulance to his son's house and sat at the kitchen table and tried one last time to explain. And when Garrett said it was a waste, Raymond put on his jacket slowly and walked to the door and said, I tried, son, and got back in the ambulance and drove away and went back to Greer Street and finished the wiring in the back room that weekend because that was who he was and the work needed to be done regardless of who understood it. He built a beginning. He built it specifically, deliberately for the person he knew would need it and would not know she needed it until she was already there, already inside the building, already holding the stethoscope with both hands. Elena closed the compartment. She sat in the ambulance for a little while longer in the last of the evening light that came through the narrow rear windows and fell across the swept floor and the polished rail and the empty space where 20 years of journals had been arranged by a careful man who trusted that the right person would find them. Then she climbed down, pulled the rear doors closed, and locked them. She crossed the lot and went back inside. There was work to do tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that. The doors were open. She was ready.